They buried her husband as a traitor on a morning so bright it felt like an insult, and the parish would not ring the bell. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the head of a grave that had no stone, only a raw wound of turned clay in the churchyard grass, and she kept her hands folded before her, because she had learned in the 3 weeks since the news came that folded hands did not shake where anyone could see them. The sea lay below the churchyard wall, flat and gray and indifferent. The same sea that had taken him and given him back a word instead of a body. Coward, deserter, traitor. The words had come home before the frigate did, carried up the coast road faster than any horse, and by the time the Admiralty's letter reached her cottage, the whole town of Combe Regis had already decided what she was: the wife of the man who ran. There was no coffin. There could be no coffin, because there was no body, because Captain Edmund Ashworth had been condemned in a room in Portsmouth he never entered, tried in his absence, and sentenced to a disgrace that outran drowning. So she had asked the sexton to dig anyway. She had put into the empty grave the only things the sea had let her keep of him: his early letters tied in a ribbon that had once been blue and was now faded near to the brown of steeped leaves, and a single brass button from a coat she had mended so many times the seams knew her fingers better than her own face did. She would not leave him with nothing. Even a man they called a traitor should have someone stand at his grave and refuse to believe it. Behind her, the mourners were not mourners. They were watchers. She could feel them as one feels a draft under a door, the whole shivering, ranked disapproval of the town, come to see whether the traitor's widow would weep or beg or fall down in the grass. A blackbird had settled on the lich gate, glossy and unbothered, and it turned its bright eye upon her, as if it were the only creature in the churchyard with no opinion of her at all. She held to that. When the curate mumbled the shortened words, the half-service they gave to suicides and criminals with no comfort in it, she looked at the blackbird and not at the ground. "You should not have come," said a low voice at her shoulder. It was Thomas Prewitt, the old harbor master, his hat crushed in his 2 great hands, his weathered face folded with a grief he did not bother to hide. "They will remember your face here, Mrs. Ashworth. They will make you pay for it in bread and in wool and in every shop on the front." "Then they will remember I did not run," Eleanor said. Her voice did not carry far. It did not need to. "He would have stood at my grave, Mr. Prewitt, whatever they said of me. I will not do him the discourtesy of a smaller love than his." Prewitt held her gaze a while, and something in his hard old eyes went soft and stayed soft. "He chose well," he said, "when he chose you. Whatever else is true, that is true." The word settled into her like a stone into a pond. Chose. She had been a plain rector's daughter with a small dowry and a smaller reputation for wit, 24 years of age, and already spoken of as a spinster, when Edmund Ashworth had crossed a crowded assembly room to ask her, of all the bright girls there, whether she would care to walk. She had never understood it. She understood it less now, standing over the hole where his good name should have been. "They say," murmured a woman behind her, not quite low enough, one of the merchant's wives with a bonnet like a battlement, that she knew, that a wife always knows, that she has hidden gold from the prize money and lets the town feed her out of pity. Eleanor did not turn. She had heard worse in 3 weeks than that woman could invent in 3 years. But she felt the whisper lodge, as a splinter lodges, and she knew already that she would carry it. That was the town's true burial. Not the grave, but the story they laid over him, packed down hard, so that no truth could ever push up through it again. She stayed until the sexton began to fill the grave, until the clay covered the letters and the button and the faded ribbon, and then she walked home alone past shop fronts where the talk stopped as she passed and started again the instant her back was turned. The cottage was cold. It had been Edmund's before it was theirs. 2 rooms and a lean-to above the harbor, low-beamed and salt-scoured, and in the good years it had smelled of tar and tobacco and the particular clean bite of the sea coming off his coat when he came home. Now it smelled only of the sea. She had let the fire go out because coal cost money, and money was a thing she no longer had in any honest form, the Navy having stopped his half-pay the day the sentence was read, as though a dead man's disgrace could be made to owe them. She lit 1 candle. She could allow herself one. And by its light she did the thing she had not been able to do at the graveside. The thing she had saved. She took down the 2nd bundle of his letters, the ones she had not buried, the ones she could not bear to give even to him, and she untied the ribbon with hands that had, at last, permission to shake. "My dear Nell," she read, aloud, because the cottage was too quiet otherwise, and because his voice lived better in her mouth than in her memory. "We are 3 days out of Plymouth, and the wind has been a scold the whole passage. But I have discovered that if I read your last letter at the change of the watch, the men suppose I am studying my orders, and so I am let alone to be happy for a quarter of an hour." She stopped. She pressed the paper flat against her breastbone. Outside, in the dark, she heard the blackbird again, or a blackbird, singing its evening song from the churchyard hedge as if nothing at all had ended that day. "I did not know," she told the empty room, "that a man could be condemned without being asked a single question. I did not know a country could be so quick to believe the worst of one of its own." She folded the letter. "But I know you, Edmund. I have your hand here, and your hand does not lie. And I will keep your name until this town forgets I ever bore it, and after that I will keep it still." That was the vow she made on the night of the burial, alone, with 1 candle and a bundle of letters and a blackbird for a witness. She did not yet imagine it would take 10 years to be answered. The years came as the tide comes, without hurry and without mercy. The first winter was the cruelest, because it was the first, and because she still half expected the town to soften. It did not soften. The wool merchant would sell to her only at the back door, and only for coin laid down first. The rector who had married them, a stout, comfortable man who had wept at their wedding, crossed the road to avoid her, and preached one Sunday on the sin of loyalty misplaced, and everyone knew whom he meant, and no one thought it unkind. Eleanor took in mending. She had a fine hand with a needle, and even the women who would not speak to her would send their linen to her by a servant, folded around a coin, because her seams were invisible and her prices were low, and shame is a great respecter of a bargain. She learned to live in subtractions. First the 2nd candle went, then the tea, then the meat, then, in the worst month, the fire itself for whole days together, so that she sat wrapped in Edmund's old boat cloak and read his letters by the gray window light until her fingers were too stiff to turn the page. There was a neighbor, a fisherman's wife named Susan Coit, who had been kind to her once in the good years, and who now would not lend her so much as a scuttle of coal. Eleanor met her at the pump one iron morning and said, gently, only, "Good morning, Mrs. Coit." And the woman looked through her as though she were made of window glass, and said to the pump handle, loudly, to no one, There are those in this town who eat the king's bread and sell the king's men. I'll not warm my hands at that fire." Then she took up her pail and went. And Eleanor stood at the pump in the cold and understood that this, too, she would have to learn to carry. And that carrying it without weeping in the street was the whole of what she had left to give her husband. In the 4th year, a man came to the cottage from the Naval Charity at Plymouth, a lean gray clerk with an ink stain on his cuff and a book of names. And he sat at her table and would not take the chair she offered, but stood, as though sitting in a trader's house might mark his coat. "You are entered here as a captain's widow," he said, tapping his book. "But the entry is queried. There is a note against the name. I am sent to determine whether the widow of a man struck from the lists may in conscience draw from a fund raised for the relief of the honorable dead." "And what have you determined?" Eleanor asked. "I have not the discretion to determine it," said the clerk. "I have the discretion to observe. I observe that you keep his miniature upon the wall where another woman would have burned it. I observe that you wear no color. I must ask you plainly, madam, for the book requires it. Do you yourself believe your husband a loyal man?" She studied him a while, and then she went to the shelf and took down not the miniature, but a letter, and she held it out to him across the table. "Read the 3rd line," she said. The clerk did not take it. "I am not sent to read letters. You are sent to observe," she said. "Then observe this. That is the hand of a man 3 weeks before he died, writing to his wife that he had done a hard thing for his country and could tell no one what it was, and begging her only to keep faith. A liar does not trouble to be cryptic with his own wife in a letter he thinks she alone will read. A liar boasts, or he explains, or he lays a false trail to save his name. This man laid nothing at all. He asked me to trust him in the dark. I have decided that a man who asks that of the person who loves him best has either earned it 100 times over or has never earned anything in his life. And I knew Edmund Ashworth. He had earned it. She set the letter down. You may write in your book that the widow was not ashamed. It is the only true thing you will carry back to Plymouth. The clerk gathered his ledger and went, and she never saw a farthing of the fund, and discovered she did not want it, but she noticed that he had, at the door, turned and given her the smallest of bows, the bow a man gives against his own instructions, and she kept that too in the drawer where she kept the things that helped. "Do you know," said Thomas Pruitt, one raw afternoon in the 2nd year, having come up from the harbor with a fish wrapped in newspaper and set it on her table as if it were nothing, as if he did it every day, which by then he did. There's not a man on that water who believes it, not one of the old ones. Edmund Ashworth put a boy over the side in a full gale off Ushant once, went himself to bring back a fool who had fallen while reefing and near drowned for the doing of it. That is not a man who runs. The Admiralty says he ran. The Admiralty, said Pruitt, and here he used a word he apologized for at once, says a great many things it has been paid or frightened into saying. I have watched 40 years of it from that harbor wall. I have seen good men broke to save the faces of bad ones. He lowered himself onto her one sound chair. I knew his father. I knew Edmund when he was a midshipman, no higher than my elbow and cheekier than the gulls. And I tell you plainly, Mrs. Ashworth, if there is a wrong here, I mean to see it made right before they put me in the ground beside him. You are the only soul in this town who says his name as though it were clean. Because it is clean, said Pruitt. The dirt is on other hands. I have only to prove whose. He could not prove it. Year upon year he could not prove it, though he wrote to men he had known in the service. though he stopped every returning captain who would give him 10 minutes on the harbor wall, though he grew gray and then white in the trying. But he came every week with a fish, or a scuttle of coal in the cold months, or only with the day's news of the tides, and he sat in her one sound chair. And he let her read him a letter, and in that reading Edmund was, for a quarter of an hour, not a traitor but a young officer in love, writing home about the strange fish and the stranger officers and the smell of oranges in a Lisbon harbor. "Listen to this one," she would say. "He is describing the captain's cat. He gives it a rank." And Pruitt would laugh, a great creaking laugh like a rope under load, and for a moment the cottage was warm whether the fire was lit or not. "Here is my favorite," she said, one evening in the 6th year, when the wind was working at the shutters, and they had between them a single tallow dip and a pot of thin tea. "It is from the year we were married. Listen. I have been made to dine 3 nights running with a Commodore who believes himself a wit, and I have laughed until my face aches at jests I did not think funny the first time. And I thought of you, Nell, sitting at the far end of some assembly, saying nothing, and being worth more in your silence than that whole loud table and its cleverness. You taught me that a person need not be entertaining to be a comfort. It is the most useful thing I ever learned, and I learned it as I learn everything worth knowing, from a woman half the county thought too quiet to notice." "He had you exact," said Pruitt gruffly. "He had me exact," she agreed, and folded it. "That is the cruelty of it, Thomas. Not that they took his life. The sea took his life. It is that they took the story of him and wrote over it in their own hand, and I am the only copy left of the true one, and I am only one woman, and one woman is so easily outshouted." "Not outlasted, though," said the old man. "There's the difference. They can outshout you any Tuesday of the year. But you have set yourself to outlast them, and that is a longer game, and the patient generally win it." He tipped what remained of the thin tea into her cup and none into his own, as he always did, and pretended he had not. "You keep reading them to me, and I'll keep coming up the hill, and between us will be the true copy for as long as it takes. A story with 2 people to tell it is uncommonly hard to kill. He had a gift for it," Pruitt said once, wiping his eyes, "making a hard place bearable. He did it aboard ship, and he does it still, off a bit of paper 10 years on. There's not one captain in 50 could do that." "9 years," said Eleanor. "It is 9 years this spring." "9, then." He looked into the cold grate. "I am no longer sure I shall live to see the 10th put right, Nell. That is the truth of it. But you will. You are younger than your griefs, though you'd not believe me if I said so." She said nothing. She only turned to the next letter and read him the part about the oranges, because she had learned that the surest way to keep a grief from swallowing you whole was to feed it, in small measured spoonfuls, something sweeter than itself. The blackbird nested every spring in the churchyard hedge above Edmund's unmarked grave. She noticed it because she went there every spring, on the anniversary, to sit on the wall and tell him the year's small news, and each year the bird was there, or its children were, singing over the flat green place where nothing was written. She began, without quite deciding to think of it as him listening. She told no one. Pruitt would not have laughed at her, but there are follies a woman keeps even from her one friend. There were nights in the low middle years when she wondered whether she had made a mistake that could not be unmade, whether a wiser woman would have taken the little the sea allowed her, changed her name, gone inland to a town that had never heard of the Aurelia, and let the dead bury the dead. She wondered it, and then she read a letter, and the wondering went out of her like a tide, because a man who wrote to a plain woman about a captain's cat with a rank, who noticed the light on a Lisbon mole and thought of home, who trusted her with his honor when the sea was done with him, was not a man you gave back to the water, because keeping him was hard. The town did not forgive her, but slowly, over the long gray middle of those years, it grew a little ashamed of itself in her presence, which is a poorer thing than forgiveness, and yet not nothing. It began with the children. Children have no politics, and hers was the warm doorway on a cold walk from school, the one place a scraped knee was bound up without a lecture, and so the children came. And then their mothers came to fetch them, and lingered, awkward, at her gate. She nursed Susan Coit through a winter fever in the 8th year. The same Susan Coit who had looked through her at the pump, because Pruitt came up the hill one night and said only, "The Coit woman is bad, and there's no one will sit with her," and Eleanor had put on her shawl and gone without a word of it. "Why did you come?" the woman rasped, when the fever broke and she understood whose cool hand had been on her forehead these 3 nights. "After what I said to you. After the pump." "Because you were ill and no one would sit with you," Eleanor said, wringing out the cloth. "It is not a complicated reason. My husband once went over the side of a ship in a gale for a man who had mocked him at supper. I asked him afterward why, and he said a person's worst hour is a poor time to settle old scores. I have found it good advice. Drink this." Susan Coit drank it, and wept a little, and said, "I was wrong about him. I was wrong about you." And Eleanor said, yes, not unkindly, only truthfully, and stayed until morning, and after that there were 2 doors on the front that opened to her, and then a 3rd, and it was not vindication, and it did not warm her as the letters did, but it taught her that a lie packed down hard over a good name is not a stone after all, only earth, and that a patient enough kindness can, given years, push a green shoot up through the very middle of it. In the 10th year, the sea gave something back. It began with a storm, a great 3-day easterly that piled the water up against the coast and tore the roofs off 2 barns and drove a collier ashore under the black rocks at Slate Point, where the currents had wrecked ships since before there were men to name them. When the wind dropped, the fishermen went out to see what the sea had loosened, for a bad blow on that coast was as good as a harvest to the men who knew where to look. And among the timbers and the weed and the sad small cargo of drowned things, they found the bones of an older wreck the storm had uncovered, a ship long buried in the shifting sand of the point, her ribs standing up out of the shallows like the fingers of a hand. Pruitt came up the hill so fast that Eleanor heard him on the path before she saw him, and when she opened the door his face was a color she had never seen upon it. "Nell," he said, and it was the first time in 10 years he had used her Christian name, and she knew before he spoke another word that the world had shifted on its hinge. "Nell, they have found the Aurelia." She put her hand on the doorframe. "The Aurelia, the frigate. Edmund's frigate, the ship they said he had run from, the ship that had gone down off Ushant with all her secrets 400 miles from this coast. That is not possible," she said. "She sank in the Channel, off France." "They all swore it," Pruitt agreed grimly. "Men have sworn a great many things these 10 years, but that is her under Slate Point, or a ship built as her twin, and there is a strong box come up out of her that a diving man has fetched to the surface, sealed and pitched and near whole, and it goes to the magistrate at Axmouth on the noon coach, and I mean for you to be standing in that room when it is opened." "They will never let me in the room." "They will let me in," said Pruitt, "for I am harbour-master still, disgrace or no disgrace, and it is my water they fished it out of. And where I am let, you are let, if I must break the door with my own shoulder." He took her hands. His own were shaking. this steady man who had not shaken at her husband's grave. 10 years, Nell. 10 years I have said the dirt is on other hands. I think the sea has just washed one of them clean. She did not answer at once. She remained in the doorway with the wind off the water, lifting the gray at her temples, and she found that she was not glad. Not yet. Not the way she had rehearsed being glad in 100 cold, sleepless dawns. She was afraid. She was afraid the box would be empty, or salt ruined, or would hold nothing but a ledger of stores and a list of dead men. She had lived so long inside the hope of this hour that the hour itself frightened her, as a prisoner is sometimes frightened by the opening of a door. "And if it is nothing, Thomas," she said, "if it is a strong box full of ruined paper and mouse nests, I have kept myself upright these 10 years on the certainty that a day like this might come. If I go down that hill and stand in that room and the box is empty, I do not know that I can carry the walk back up again." Pruitt looked at her steadily. "Then I will carry you," he said, "as I have carried the fish. But it will not be empty, Nell. The sea does not keep a thing whole for 10 years and pitch it and seal it and drive it back onto the one stretch of coast where the one woman waits who would know what to do with it, only to hand you an empty box. I am too old to believe in much. I have decided to believe in that. Put on your shawl." She put on her shawl. The magistrate's room at Axmouth was long and low and smelled of beeswax and old paper, and it filled that afternoon with more of the county's importance than had gathered under one roof since the assizes. Word had run ahead of the coach as words run on that coast, and by the time the strong box was carried in, dripping still and crusted with the gray scurf of 10 years under the sea, the room held 2 magistrates, a naval lieutenant sent down in a hurry from Plymouth, the wool merchant, the rector, 3 of the merchants' wives with their battlement bonnets, and a press of townsfolk at the door who had come to watch the traitor's widow be shamed all over again. Eleanor stood at the back beside Thomas Pruitt in her dark mourning shawl, the same shawl, mended and mended, and she kept her hands folded before her, because folded hands do not shake where anyone can see them, and she had had 10 years of practice. The naval lieutenant was young and very conscious of it. He wore his authority like a coat cut for a larger man. "The seal," he announced to the room, "is an Admiralty seal, gentlemen, unbroken. Whatever this box holds has not been touched by human hand since it went down. I will ask the room to witness that I break it under the eyes of the magistracy and not otherwise." "Break it then," said the elder magistrate, "and let us have done. The coach north waits for no wreck." The lieutenant broke the seal. There is a particular silence that falls when a great many people are all holding the same breath, and it fell now, and into it the lieutenant lifted a packet of oilskin, black and glistening, bound in tarred twine, and the oilskin had done its work, for the papers within, when he cut the twine and unfolded them, were dry. 10 years under the sea, and they were dry, and the ink upon them was as black as the day it was set down. The lieutenant read the first line to himself. Eleanor watched the young pride go out of his face, and something older and more careful come into it. "Read it aloud, sir," the elder magistrate ordered. "The room is witness, or it is nothing." The lieutenant swallowed. "These," he said, "are sealed orders. Admiralty orders, of the most secret kind, signed by the board and by the First Lord himself." He looked up, and for the first time his eyes found Eleanor at the back of the room, though he did not yet guess who she was. "They are directed to the commanding officer of His Majesty's frigate Aurelia, to Captain Edmund Ashworth." The room made a sound like a wave drawing back off shingle. "Read them," the magistrate said again. And the lieutenant read. He read that Captain Edmund Ashworth had been detached from the line of battle off Ushant, not through cowardice, not through desertion, but by the express and secret command of the Admiralty itself, that he had been ordered, on pain of court-martial should he reveal his purpose to any living soul, to slip his station under cover of the general engagement and carry a certain passenger and a certain packet to a certain harbor on the coast of Spain, upon business the orders named of the first importance to the safety of the realm, that he was forbidden absolutely to communicate the reason for his withdrawal to his squadron, to the fleet, or to the board of any court that might sit in judgment upon him. For the enemy had eyes even within the Admiralty, and the secrecy of the mission was reckoned worth more than the reputation of any single officer, however brave. He was ordered to let them call him a coward, Pruitt murmured, very low, beside her. They ordered the man to hang for them and hold his tongue about the rope. The lieutenant read on, and his voice changed as he read, for he was a naval officer too, and he understood, in a manner the magistrates did not, exactly what had been asked of Edmund Ashworth and exactly what it had cost. There was a final passage, an instruction that in the event of the captain's death the orders were to be recovered and the record set right, that no true servant of the crown shall lie forever under a false disgrace. Someone had written that. Some man in a warm room in London had written that clause and then let 10 years pass without recovering anything at all. Because the ship had not sunk where they thought, and dead men make no complaint, and it is always easier to leave a grave unmarked than to confess that a state has wronged the woman standing over it. The lieutenant lowered the papers. The room did not move. Is the widow of Captain Ashworth known to be living? He asked the magistrates. These orders require, by the hand of the board, that the record be set right. There is prize money owing. There is the half-pay stopped in error. There is he faltered. There is a name to be restored. For a moment no one spoke. And then Thomas Pruitt, harbor master of Combe Regis, took Eleanor Ashworth by the elbow and drew her forward through a crowd that parted before her now as though she were made of fire, past the wool merchant who could not meet her eye, past the rector who had once preached against loyalty misplaced, past the 3 merchants' wives whose battlement bonnets had gone quite still, until she stood in the light from the long window before the magistrates and the young lieutenant, and the open, unbroken truth. "She is living," said Pruitt. "She has been living, sir, on fish I carried up a hill, and on the labor of her own 2 hands, for 10 years, in a town that buried her husband under a lie. This is Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth, and I should be glad, before I die, to hear one man in this county say her name as though it were clean." The lieutenant looked at her a long moment, and then, in front of all of them, he did a thing that undid her more thoroughly than any cruelty had in 10 years. He stood, and he bowed to her. A full formal bow such as a young officer gives to the widow of a senior captain, and he said, "Mrs. Ashworth, on behalf of the board, and to my own great shame that it comes so late, I beg your pardon." She had not wept at the grave. She had not wept in 10 winters of subtractions. She did not weep now, not quite. But she felt the thing that had been packed down hard over her husband's name for 10 years begin, at last, to break up, as ice breaks on a river in the first warmth, with a long groaning crack that is almost a voice. "I do not want your pardon, sir," she said. And her voice was not loud, but it carried, and the room strained to catch it. "I have done nothing that wants pardoning. I married a brave man, and I kept his name when it cost me every friend but one, and I was right to do it. What I want," she stopped, She made herself say it plainly, because plainness was the only tongue the truth had ever spoken to her in. What I want is his stone. I want it cut with his rank and his name and the truth of him, and I want it set over the grave at Combe Regis where they would not ring the bell, and I want every soul who whispered over that grave to read it every Sunday for the rest of their lives. You shall have it, said the old magistrate, and his voice was rough. By God, madam, you shall have it if I pay for the stone myself. There is no need, the lieutenant said quietly. The Admiralty will pay for the stone. It is the least of what the Admiralty owes. Eleanor Ashworth looked around that long, low room at the faces that would not meet her eyes, and she found she had no wish at all to see them cringe. That surprised her. She had pictured this moment, in the black months, pictured it as a fire she would walk through them like a righteous flame. But standing in it, she felt only tired and clean and possessed of one desire, which was to go home to the cold cottage and take down the bundle of letters she had not buried and read them to their author and tell him it was over, that the sea had spoken, that the town would carry his true name now, whether it wished to or not. She turned to go, and the wool merchant of all men, the wool merchant who had sold to her only at the back door and only for coin laid down first, stepped into her path, and his heavy face was working, and he said, Mrs. Ashworth, eat the coal. This winter. If you would allow me to, you may send it, she said, not unkindly, for she found that unkindness, too, had lost its savor. He would have told me to let you. He always did think better of people than they deserved. She paused. It is a fault I have decided to acquire. She did not go straight home. Pruitt walked her as far as the churchyard, the two of them saying little on the road, as people say little when a thing too large has happened, and words are too small a bucket to bail it, and at the lych gate he stopped. I'll not come in, he said. This hour is yours and his. He turned his crushed hat in his two great hands, the same gesture he had made at the burial, and his old eyes were wet, and he did not fold them away. I told you, he said. For 10 years I told you the dirt was on other hands. You told me, she agreed. Every week you told me. There is not another man in England who would have carried a fish up that hill for 10 years to keep a traitor's widow from starving in the dark. He was my friend, said Pruitt simply. And you, he stopped. You are the finest thing that Broken Town ever failed to be worthy of. That is all. Go and tell him. She went in alone. The blackbird was on the hedge above the grave, glossy and bright-eyed and singing, and she stood before the flat green place where nothing was written, where soon there would be a stone, and she said aloud, in the empty churchyard, They know Edmund the Sea gave up the box. They know what they asked of you, and they know you did it, and they know I was right. 10 years, my love. But they know. The blackbird sang. She chose to believe he heard. The stone came in the autumn. It was a great slab of good gray granite, and the Admiralty had not been mean with it, and the mason cut it deep so that the truth would outlast the men who had denied it. Eleanor had written the words herself and would let no one change them. Captain Edmund Ashworth, it read, of His Majesty's frigate Aurelia, and below that his years. And below that, in letters as deep as a thumb is wide, he died in secret service to his country, and was called a traitor by men who were not fit to carry his orders. And below that, smaller, in the widow's own choosing, his name is restored. He was loved. They said it on a bright cold morning, and this time the parish rang the bell. It rang out over the harbor and the gray indifferent sea, and it did not stop at the churchyard wall, and half the town came to hear it, whether from shame or wonder or the simple animal need to be present at a reversal. And that same rector who had shunned her read the whole service this time, every word of it, the entire comfort he had withheld, and if his voice trembled, Eleanor did not begrudge it. But it was not in the churchyard that the true reckoning came. That came a fortnight later, at the assembly rooms. There was to be a subscription ball at Michaelmas, as there was every year, in the long assembly rooms above the harbor where the county gathered to dance and to be seen and to arrange its marriages and its enmities under the light of a great many candles. 10 years before, in the first raw winter of her widowhood, Eleanor had gone to those rooms once, on the arm of no one, because she would not be made to hide. And she had been turned away at the door by a steward who told her, not meeting her eyes, that her subscription was not found among the lists, though she had paid it, and everyone in the queue behind her had heard, and no one had said a word in her defense. She had not gone back. In 10 years she had not once gone back. This season an invitation came, cream-laid and gilt-edged, in the hand of the master of ceremonies himself, and with it a note, much blotted, in which that gentleman begged Mrs. Ashworth to do the rooms the very great honor of her attendance, and to accept his most abject apology for a discourtesy some years past, for which he could offer no excuse but the general madness of a town that had lost its senses. Pruitt read it over her shoulder and made a sound in his throat. "You'll not go," he said. "You owe them nothing. Let them dance without you and choke on it." "I shall go," said Eleanor, "but not to be forgiven, Thomas. I have decided I am done being either shamed or pardoned. I am going to read them a letter." He stared at her. "A letter? His letter," she said. "The one he wrote from Lisbon the week before his orders came, when he did not yet know what would be asked of him. He wrote it about me, though he pretended it was about the harbor. I have read it to you a dozen times over that fire. I think it is time the town heard the man they buried, not the traitor they invented. The man." She wore the dark mourning shawl, mended and mended, over a gown of good plain gray, for she would not costume herself as a thing she was not, and she walked into the assembly rooms above the harbor on the arm of Thomas Pruitt, who had put on his one good coat and brushed it until it shone, and the whole bright rustling room fell quiet, as a room falls quiet when the person it has wronged walks into the light of it. The master of ceremonies came forward at once, all bows, and would have made a speech, but she forestalled him gently. "You are very good, sir," she said. "I ask only one kindness of the room, and then I shall trouble it no further. I ask leave to read something aloud. It will not take long, and then you may all dance, and I shall go home." They gave her leave. They could hardly refuse. The candles burned, amber and warm, over the faces that had whispered above her husband's grave, and she stood in the middle of the long room and drew from her reticule a single letter, worn thin at the folds from 100 readings, the paper gone soft as cloth, and she unfolded it, and she read. "My dear Nell," she read, and her voice did not shake, for she had had 10 years of practice at not shaking where anyone could see. "You will laugh at me, for I am about to write 2 pages upon the subject of a harbor, and pretend the whole while that I am not writing about you. There is a harbor here at Lisbon that puts me in mind of home, though it is grander and the light is gold where ours is gray. I stood upon the mole this evening and watched the fishing boats come in, and I thought, as I always think, of the day I first saw you across the assembly rooms at Combe Regis, and could not for my life understand why every other man there had failed to cross the floor to you. You were not the brightest thing in the room. You will forgive me for saying so. You have always preferred the truth. You were the truest thing in the room. There is a difference, and it took me 28 years of life to learn it, and I learned it in an evening. Watching you refuse to feign a wit you did not care for and a laughter you did not feel, and folding your own hands instead. So still, so plain, so entirely yourself. I have sailed with men who were the brightest thing in every room, and I would not trust one of them to hold a rope in a squall. And I have known one woman who was the truest thing in every room she entered, and I would trust her with my name, my life, and whatever remains of my honor when the sea is done with me. So when I write to you of harbors, Nell, understand that I am writing of the only harbor I have ever known. You are the water I come home to. Whatever weather they call down upon me out here, and there is weather coming, I can feel it in the orders they have not yet given me. I have this to hold, that I am loved by the truest woman in England, and that she knows me, and that her knowing is worth more than the good opinion of every admiral in the fleet. Keep my name warm by your fire. I shall come home to it. And if by some mischance I do not, then keep it warm the longer. For a name is only as good as the one who remembers it. And you, my dear, my true, my only Nell, remember better than the whole world put together. She folded the letter. The assembly rooms were entirely silent. Somewhere a candle guttered. Eleanor looked up, and she looked without hurry from face to face at the master of the rooms with his hand pressed to his mouth, at the merchants' wives whose battlement bonnets were bowed now, at the rector standing white and stricken by the wall, at the wool merchant weeping openly and not caring who saw, and she felt the last of the packed-down years break loose and float away upon the warm candle-lit air. "That is the man you buried as a traitor," she said. "That is the man whose grave you would not ring a bell over. He gave his good name to keep a secret that kept you safe in your beds, and he was ordered to let you spit upon it, and he obeyed, because obedience was the last service his country asked of him, and he was not a man to refuse a hard order. I do not tell you this to shame you. I have grown very tired of shame. It is a poor fire, and it gives no heat. I tell you so that you will know what you had among you, and lost, and never deserved. His name is restored, and it was always, always loved." She curtsied to the room, a small, plain, perfect curtsy, and she took Thomas Pruitt's arm, and she walked out through a doorway where once a steward had turned her away, and this time the whole room rose to its feet as she passed, and no one spoke a single word, because there was not a word in the language equal to it, and they knew it, and for once in the history of that gossiping town, they held their tongues. They did not go home in silence. Halfway down the hill, Pruitt stopped under the one lamp on the harbor road and wiped his old face with the back of his great hand and said, "I have lived a long time. I have never seen the like of that, and I never shall again." "You gave me the 10 years that made it possible," Eleanor said. "A woman who had starved alone could not have stood in that room and pitied them. It was your fish, Thomas. It was your coal in the cold. It was your one sound chair and your creaking laugh at the captain's cat with a rank. You kept me whole enough to forgive them. So it is as much your reckoning as mine." The old man could not answer that. He only offered her his arm again, and they went on down the hill to the sea. "There is one thing I would ask you," she said, when they had reached the harbor wall, when they read the orders, and everyone stood so still. "Were you thinking of him, or of the men who let it lie 10 years? Pruitt considered it honestly, as he considered everything. "Neither," he said at last. "I was thinking that a man may be gone entirely off the earth, Nell, and still reach up out of the water and set one thing right, if only he leaves behind him someone stubborn enough to wait for it. That was you. He knew what he was about, choosing you. She did not trust her voice, so she only pressed his arm, and they stood a while and watched the dark water swallow the day's last light. She did not marry again. There were those, afterward, when the Admiralty's prize money came and she was suddenly a woman of some property, who thought she might, who put respectable widowers and hopeful captains in her path. But Eleanor Ashworth had had one great love and one great loyalty, and knew she wanted no smaller portion of either. She used the money as she believed Edmund would have wished. She endowed a school in the town for the children of drowned sailors, so that no widow's child in Combe Regis need go without letters. And she paid, out of her own hand, for a bell to be recast for the church, a great sweet-voiced bell, so that never again could that parish plead it had no proper bell to ring for an honest man's grave. Thomas Pruitt she cared for to the end of his days, which came 4 years later, quietly, in his sleep, in a chair by her fire, and she buried him in the churchyard within sight of Edmund's stone, and she paid for his stone too, and had it cut. Thomas Pruitt. Harbour-master, he believed a true thing when it cost him to believe it. She thought he would have liked that better than any grander word. And every spring, on the anniversary of the bright morning they had put her husband in the ground under a false name, she went to the churchyard and sat on the wall. It was on such a morning, many years on, an old woman now with her needle laid by and her hands gone soft and unshaking at last, that she came up the churchyard path in the early light with a bundle beneath her arm. The morning was bright as that first insulting morning had been, but she had made her peace long ago with bright mornings. The sea below the wall was flat and gray and indifferent, but she had made her peace with the sea as well. For the sea had lied for 10 years and then, in its own slow season, told the truth. A blackbird sat on the lich gate, glossy and bright-eyed, turning its head to consider her, as unbothered by her grief and her triumph alike as its great-grandfather's had been. She sat on the wall before the 2 stones, the great gray slab and the smaller one beside it, and she untied the bundle. It was the letters. The early ones had gone into the ground with him 10 years before the sea confessed. But these, which she had never buried, which she had read to the town and to the fire, and to the empty rooms of her long life, these she had kept, tied in a ribbon that had once been blue and was now faded near to the brown of steeped leaves, and she had at last decided what should become of them. "I am going to leave you the letters," she told the stone, "and the blackbird, and the indifferent sea. The school shall have them, to keep under glass, so the children will know that a name is worth keeping even when the whole world tells you to let it fall. And they shall know your name, Edmund, not the traitor they invented. You, the man who wrote to a plain woman about a harbor and meant that he loved her." She laid the bundle at the foot of the stone, the faded ribbon, the letters worn soft as cloth, the whole small weight of a great love, upon the grass where nothing had been written for 10 long years, and where now the deep-cut truth stood in granite for anyone to read. Behind her, at the lich gate, the blackbird sang, and from the road above the churchyard a woman going by, a young merchant's wife with a child by the hand, paused to look at the fine old widow at the 2 stones, and said to her little daughter, in a low voice she did not think would carry, that is Mrs. Ashworth, "They say she loved him so well that the very sea gave up its secrets to prove her right. They say a love the like of that comes back from the dead." And Eleanor Ashworth, who had once stood at that grave and felt a whispered lie lodge in her like a splinter, heard this whispered truth settle into her instead, warm as candlelight, and she did not turn, and she did not correct it, and she let the child carry the story away down the road unspoiled. "You hear that, my love?" she said softly to the stone. "They tell it right now. It only took them a lifetime." The blackbird lifted from the lich gate and was gone over the gray water. She folded her old soft hands in her lap, the thumb pressed flat, so still, so plain, so entirely herself, and she sat a while longer in the bright morning with the sea below and the deep-cut letters before her, keeping his name warm, as she had promised, on the night of the burial, with one candle and a bundle of letters and a blackbird for a witness. If you have ever kept faith with someone the whole world had given up on, if you have ever stood alone at a graveside and refused to believe the easy, cruel story, then this story was for you. Stay a while by our fire and tell me in the comments below whose name you would keep warm against the whole world's whispering. Subscribe, and I shall keep the candles lit for you here, and a chair by the hearth, for there are more stories waiting in the dark, and the tide of them never quite goes out. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle with yourself.